Have you ever been the friend who gives everything, only to be met with silence? You know the feeling. You reach out first. You remember the small details of their life. You send the message that never gets a reply. Days pass, then weeks, and you begin to notice that the energy you pour into the connection does not echo back. It is as if you are standing in a canyon, shouting into the vastness, only to hear your own voice return. There is no response from the other side, no acknowledgement that you exist beyond the moment of convenience. It begins with small things, a forgotten birthday, an unanswered call, a casual, "I've been busy." At first, you excuse it. You tell yourself that everyone is overwhelmed, that neglect is not personal. But deep inside, the silence starts to spread like frost over the soil of your trust. You tend the garden of this friendship, watering it with effort and memory, while on the other side, the soil lies dry, untouched, abandoned. A garden cannot flourish when only one pair of hands tends to it. Think of the warmth you once felt when a friend remembered the tiniest detail, your favorite book, your secret fear, the day you had a difficult exam. That warmth is not trivial. Neuroscientists tell us that to be remembered, to be acknowledged, activates the same pathways in the brain as physical safety. It is the nervous system saying, "I belong, I matter." So when that recognition is absent, when your effort is met with neglect, the body responds with the opposite, a quiet ache, a subtle alarm of rejection. Your heart learns to hesitate before reaching out again. And yet, the neglectful friend rarely storms in like a villain. They do not destroy the bond with rage or betrayal. They destroy it with absence. The pain is not in what they do, but in what they fail to do. It is a wound made not by a strike, but by the air between you, a wound carved by what never arrives. You look at them and wonder if you ever truly existed in their world, or if you were simply a convenience, a placeholder in the silence of their days. But perhaps the ache of being forgotten reveals something deeper, that neglect in friendship is never just about them. It awakens in you the ghost of every moment you felt invisible before. The friend who forgets you becomes a mirror, reflecting the older, unhealed absence you have carried all along. And it is there, in that echo, that the true story of the neglectful friend begins to unfold. Have you ever seen a child waiting by the window, eyes fixed on the driveway, convinced that sooner or later the sound of footsteps will come? The minutes stretch into hours, the sky darkens, and still no one arrives. That child learns something without ever being told, that love is not steady, that presence cannot be relied on, that their longing may always end in silence. This is where neglect begins, not in adulthood, not in the careless messages left unanswered, but in the first, fragile moments when a young heart reaches out and finds no one there. A parent who is too consumed with their own chaos, too distracted by their own storms, does not need to say, "You don't matter." The absence itself becomes the message. Over time, the child's nervous system adapts, building walls of self-sufficiency, training itself not to expect too much. After all, expectation only brings pain. Psychologists call this an avoidant attachment pattern. The child, unable to regulate the crushing disappointment of unmet needs, learns to detach. Neuroscience shows us that repeated experiences of neglect shape the brain's pathways, teaching it to mute the craving for closeness. The young mind begins to treat intimacy as dangerous territory, a place where hope is too easily betrayed. And so, detachment becomes survival. But there is a quiet cruelty in this adaptation. What starts as a shield for the child becomes a mask for the adult. They grow into the friend who struggles to remember the details of your life, not because they do not care in the moment, but because caring deeply was never safe for them. They learned early that love is fragile, conditional, fleeting, and so they keep it at arm's length. Imagine that window again. The child, now older, no longer waits by it. They turn away, pretending not to notice the absence. They act as though the emptiness is normal, even expected. This is the seed of the neglectful friend. Someone who learned to normalize emotional absence, who carries forward the silent lesson that closeness can be optional, that bonds can survive without tending. And when you meet them later in life, when you call them friend, you are not just meeting the person they are now. You are meeting every window they ever stood by, every unanswered need that sculpted their way of loving. To understand the neglectful friend is to look not only at the distance they create today, but at the shadows cast long ago, in rooms where a child learned that presence was never guaranteed. And it is from these early shadows that the mask of adulthood begins to take shape, the mask that hides neglect behind busyness, independence, and polite smiles. Have you noticed how some people master the art of being present only when it suits them? They smile warmly when you cross paths. They tell you how much they value you. Yet when the moment comes to prove it, when you need them to call, to show up, to remember, they vanish into a fog of excuses. I've just been busy. It is their shield, their mask, their carefully rehearsed line, and behind that mask, a quiet truth hides. Intimacy feels like a demand they cannot meet. The neglectful friend often does not realize how sharp their silence feels. To them, the absence is casual, a natural extension of the life they've built around distance. They learned long ago that closeness was risky, that to rely too heavily on another could lead to disappointment. So now, as an adult, they disguise this avoidance with a performance of busyness. They let the unanswered message linger, not because they have nothing to say, but because responding would draw them too close, too quickly. Picture this. You pour your heart into a late-night conversation, sharing the weight of your secrets. In that moment, they seem there, nodding, responding, reassuring. But a few days later, when you reach out again, there is nothing. No follow-up, no effort, no memory of what you gave them. It feels like speaking into an empty room. You begin to question yourself. Was the connection real, or was it only a reflection of your own longing? Psychologists tell us that avoidance often wears the costume of independence. Research on attachment styles shows that avoidant individuals prize self-reliance so heavily that even friendships are kept at a safe distance. Neuroscience suggests that the brain, when trained by neglect, dulls its response to social bonds, treating intimacy not as nourishment, but as threat. And so, they cultivate a rhythm of selective caring present one day, absent the next, leaving you suspended between warmth and cold. The metaphor of the mask is fitting. On the surface, the friend appears kind, engaged, even loyal. But like a mask that slips when the actor leaves the stage, their attention fades as soon as the spotlight moves. What remains is the silence, the forgotten questions, the birthdays that pass unnoticed. The mask smiles, but it never stays. And the sting of this neglect is not in grand betrayals, but in small, repeated absences. You begin to realize that you are always the one who remembers, always the one who reaches first, always the one holding the weight of the bond. The neglect is subtle, but its sharpness cuts deeper than open hostility ever could. This is how childhood absence grows into adult dismissal. The garden once left unwatered is now carefully hidden behind the facade of a busy life. And if you look closely, you will see that beneath the mask of independence lies not strength, but the same old shadow of fear, the fear of being too close, too needed, too seen. Why does a friend who claims to care for you disappear when you need them most? Why does someone who laughs with you in one moment seem unreachable in the next? The answer is not always cruelty or malice, but often something quieter, buried deep within the architecture of the mind. Psychology tells us that neglect in adulthood is rarely born in adulthood. It is the echo of patterns first learned in childhood, woven into the nervous system until distance feels safer than closeness. Attachment theory offers us a lens to understand this. Some people develop what is known as an avoidant attachment style, a way of relating where intimacy feels suffocating, where reliance on others feels like a threat to survival. As children, they reached out for comfort and were met with absence, indifference, or conditional affection. Their young brains adapted, teaching them to expect rejection, to suppress their need for connection. The paradox is cruel. The more they wanted closeness, the more their bodies warned them against it. And so, as adults, they repeat the same script. When you draw near, they step back. When you ask for more, they offer less. Neuroscience shows us how powerful these imprints are. Studies using brain imaging reveal that chronic neglect reshapes pathways involved in social bonding. Areas like the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, which regulate trust and emotional safety, become hyper-alert to the risks of attachment. The body learns to calm itself not through connection, but through withdrawal. It is as if the mind erects invisible walls, protecting the person from the very thing they long for. Even the subtleties of human interaction reveal this struggle. Research on mirror neurons, the cells that allow us to empathize and reflect each other's emotions, shows that when someone avoids connection, they disrupt the natural reciprocity that friendships rely on. You smile, they look away. You share, they go silent. It is not simply forgetfulness, but a neurological pattern of distance, one that confuses both giver and receiver. And then there is the cognitive dissonance. The neglectful friend often tells themselves, "I care, I value this person." And, in a sense, they do. But the moment that caring requires effort, presence, or vulnerability, their old script takes over, pulling them back into silence. The dissonance between their words and actions is not hypocrisy, but the residue of a survival strategy written long ago. When you encounter the neglectful friend, you are not meeting a villain. You are meeting someone whose mind was trained to confuse love with danger, whose nervous system whispers, "Protect yourself," every time intimacy knocks on the door. And this framing shifts the perspective. Neglect in friendship is not always a choice to wound, but a symptom of wounds left unhealed. But even understanding this, the shadow remains. For you, the one on the receiving end, the absence still cuts deep, and the science cannot erase the sting. And it is in this shadow that the darker truth of neglect begins to show itself, not just as a pattern explained, but as a quiet cruelty lived. What wounds deeper? A friend who betrays you with harsh words, or a friend who simply disappears when you need them most? You might think betrayal must come with anger, with violence, with clear cruelty, but sometimes the sharpest pain is delivered in silence. It is not the storm that breaks you, but the drought, the slow erosion of warmth, until nothing remains but dust. Neglect has a shadowed cruelty that is hard to name because it leaves no obvious scars. A neglectful friend rarely lashes out, they rarely accuse or condemn. Instead, they vanish in small ways. A text left unanswered, a promise forgotten, a moment when you needed to be seen and found only absence. Over time, this silence becomes its own kind of violence. It is not a sword, but an emptiness that hollows you out from within. Imagine sitting across from someone you call a friend, pouring your heart into words, only to see their eyes glaze over, their thoughts drift elsewhere. In that instant, you realize you are alone, even in their presence. Psychologists call this micro-neglect, subtle cues that you do not fully matter. Neuroscience shows that social rejection, even in its quietest form, triggers the same regions of the brain as physical pain. The neglectful friend may never raise their voice, but your body feels the wound as though struck. The paradox is haunting. Neglect feels unintentional, and often, it island, they do not set out to hurt you. Yet the result is the same. Absence becomes betrayal. The neglectful friend convinces themselves that silence is harmless, but to you, it becomes a heavy weight, a reminder that your presence is optional, your care disposable. Trust does not collapse all at once. It crumbles slowly, like a house eaten from within by termites, until one day you realize the structure is hollow. And this is why neglect can be more devastating than overt cruelty. At least betrayal has a name, a story, a memory you can point to. Neglect offers only confusion. You are left wondering if you are too sensitive, if you expected too much, if the friendship ever truly existed at all. It is an erasure that forces you to question your own worth. The shadow of neglect is not only in what is withheld, but in the questions it plants inside you. Questions that echo long after the friendship fades. Was I ever important? Did I matter at all? In this way, absence becomes more haunting than presence ever could. And yet, as heavy as this shadow is, society often teaches you to excuse it, to call it independence, low maintenance, even maturity. The cruelty hides beneath a mask of normalcy, but when you peel that mask away, you begin to see how deeply the culture around you enables this silent wound. Have you ever been told that the best friendships are the ones that require no effort? That a real friend is someone you can go months without speaking to, and then simply pick up where you left off? It sounds noble, almost romantic, a bond so strong that it needs no tending. But beneath this story lies a quieter truth. What we often glorify as independence is sometimes just neglect dressed in disguise. Society feeds you the myth of the low-maintenance friend as if it were a badge of honor. In a culture obsessed with busyness, where productivity is worshipped and stillness is seen as weakness, the idea of friendships that ask for nothing becomes appealing. You're told not to be clingy, not to need too much, because needing is portrayed as a flaw. But what is friendship, if not the exchange of care, the acknowledgement that presence matters? A garden that claims to grow without water is not a miracle, it is already dying. Think of the way people brag about how little effort they invest. We don't talk every day, but when we do, it's like nothing changed. And sometimes that is true, but other times it is an excuse. It allows absence to masquerade as loyalty. It teaches you to lower your expectations, to accept crumbs of attention and call it love. This conditioning is not accidental. It is built into the way modern society prizes self-sufficiency above connection. We are trained to believe that the strongest people need no one, and by extension, that the strongest friendships require nothing. Yet neuroscience tells a different story. Studies on human bonding reveal that frequent, small gestures of attention, a check-in, a shared memory, a simple acknowledgement, activate neural pathways that reinforce trust. Relationships, like muscles, atrophy when unused, but culture convinces you that to expect these gestures is weakness, that to ask for care is to risk being labelled too much, and so you silence your needs, smiling as though absence doesn't ache. The neglectful friend thrives in this myth because it protects them. Their silence is normalized, their absence excused. You are told to be grateful for the scraps of presence they offer, while ignoring the slow erosion of intimacy. And in this way, neglect is not only personal, it is cultural, systemic, almost celebrated. But deep down, you know the truth. Bonds that are never watered do not deepen, they hollow. Friendships that rely solely on the myth of timelessness often collapse under the weight of silence. The culture may tell you that love without effort is proof of strength, but you can feel it. Real connection is not effortless. It is chosen, again and again, in the small and ordinary moments. And when those choices are absent, the cost begins to seep inward, shaping not just your friendships, but your very sense of worth. That is where the emotional consequences of neglect begin to take root. What does it do to you when the people you care for most barely notice your existence? Not through cruelty, not through words meant to wound, but through silence so consistent it begins to shape the way you see yourself. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who never truly show up. It is the weight of being unseen, heavy, invisible, and endlessly exhausting. Picture yourself scrolling back through old conversations. Message after message, you find your words reaching out, your efforts bridging the distance, your reminders keeping the thread alive. And then you notice a pattern. Every "how are you" is yours. Every "let's meet" begins with you. Every lifeline of connection is one you have thrown. On the surface, this might look trivial, but in your chest it burns. Because friendship is supposed to be a dance, and yet you are always the one moving, always the one reaching, always the one pulling dead weight across. The flaw. Neuroscience tells us that the human brain is wired for reciprocity. When you smile and someone smiles back, your mirror neurons light up, affirming that you belong. But when you smile and the other person looks away, those circuits falter. Over time, this repeated absence begins to reshape your self-image. You stop believing you are worth the return. You start to wonder if you are too needy, too fragile, too much. The neglect does not simply starve the friendship, it starves your sense of self. The emotional toll deepens in silence. Anxiety creeps in as you wait for replies that never come, the clock ticking louder with each unread message. Resentment follows, though you try to bury it. You tell yourself not to care, but your body cares anyway. Studies show that social neglect activates the same pain centers as physical injury. That ache in your chest, that sinking in your stomach, is not imagined. It is the biology of rejection, echoing through your nervous system, like a warning you cannot silence. And then depression arrives, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow dimming. You stop reaching out, you stop expecting joy, you stop believing in the possibility of being chosen. The weight of being unseen pulls you inward, until even your reflection feels like a stranger. This is the cruelty of neglect. It convinces you that invisibility is your fault, that being overlooked means you are unworthy of attention. And once you start to believe this, the neglect does not even need to continue. You begin to neglect yourself, carrying forward the same silence you once received. But here lies the deeper question: must you accept invisibility as your destiny? Or is there a way to step out of the shadows and reclaim your worth? The answer begins not in them, but in you, in the courage to break the cycle and choose friendships that water the garden of your soul. How do you free yourself from the quiet ache of being overlooked? How do you break the cycle of silence without hardening into bitterness? The truth is, healing from neglect does not begin by forcing the other person to change. It begins in the mirror, in the subtle decision to no longer confuse crumbs of attention with the feast of real friendship. You may have spent years over-investing in bonds that never gave back, mistaking one-sided effort for loyalty. But loyalty that drains you is not devotion, it is self-abandonment. The first step is recognition, seeing the pattern clearly, naming the imbalance without softening it with excuses. Psychology shows us that the act of naming unmet needs reduces their power, shifting the brain from survival mode into awareness. Awareness is the beginning of freedom. Imagine journaling the moments when you felt unseen, the unanswered calls, the forgotten milestones, the conversations that left you hollow. On the page, those fragments no longer swirl like ghosts. They take shape, revealing not just their pain, but their pattern. And in that pattern, you find the courage to set boundaries. Boundaries are not walls of punishment. They are gates of preservation. They tell you, and others, that your time, your love, and your presence are sacred. Reframing worth is the next step. Neuroscience teaches that self-concept is malleable. The brain rewires in response to repeated messages. If neglect has whispered to you for years that you are too much, too needy, too expendable, then conscious self-reminders act like antidotes. Every time you affirm your own value, every time you choose a connection that nourishes rather than depletes, you rewire the pathways of belonging. This is not the work of a single day, but of steady persistence, a new rhythm of care that begins from within. And then comes conscious detachment. Not the cold detachment of avoidance, but the gentle release of expectations placed on those who cannot meet them. You stop watering gardens that have long been abandoned. You stop writing letters to doors that never open. Instead, you redirect your energy toward reciprocity, the friendships where your presence is mirrored, where your care is returned in kind. Breaking the cycle does not mean cutting people off in anger, though sometimes that is necessary. It means choosing with clarity rather than desperation. It means realizing that forgiveness is not the same as access, and that healing requires you to walk toward those who see you, not chase those who never did. The path out of neglect is not paved with revenge or bitterness, but with courage, the courage to choose differently, to honor the truth of your own worth. And when you begin to live this way, you uncover something profound. That real connection is not found in silence, but in the steady, chosen presence of those who refuse to let you go unseen. And yet, even with clarity and new strength, the question lingers. What does it mean, in the end, to be truly seen? And how does that truth reshape not only your friendships, but your very sense of life itself? What is a friendship if not a garden? You tend it with small gestures, you water it with presence, you let it grow in the sunlight of attention. And yet, too often, you find yourself pouring water into soil that stays dry, waiting for a bloom that never comes. The truth is simple, though painful. No garden survives without care. No bond thrives without effort. Neglect is not neutrality, it is a slow decay, a withering that happens in silence. The neglectful friend may leave you questioning yourself, wondering if your roots were weak, if your petals were never beautiful enough to hold their gaze. But this is the great illusion of neglect. Their absence does not reveal your lack of worth. It reveals their blindness to intimacy. It shows the scars they carry, the shadows they have yet to face, the walls they never dared to tear down. You are not unseen because you are unworthy. You are unseen because they never learned how to look. Philosophers have long argued that to be truly seen is a form of love, not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet acknowledgement of your existence. To be remembered, to be listened to be chosen again and again in the smallest of ways, is what makes life bearable. It is what teaches your nervous system safety, what reassures your heart that you belong. When that is absent, you begin to starve, not for attention, but for recognition. And that starvation is one of the deepest hungers a human being can endure. But here lies the turning point. You cannot force a barren garden to bloom. You cannot make someone see you who has chosen blindness. What you can do is step out of the drought and seek the soil that welcomes rain. You can choose to give your care to those who return it, to those who understand that love is not proved in words but in presence. And in doing so, you teach yourself a truth that neglect tried to erase. Your worth does not diminish in silence. It waits, quietly, for the place where it will finally be recognized. So, let this be the reflection you carry forward. A neglectful friend is not a mirror of your value, but a mirror of their limits. You deserve more than being tolerated in the background of someone else's life. You deserve to be seen, remembered, chosen, and cherished. To be seen is a form of love, and you deserve to be seen. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all that. Friendship, like a garden, is sacred only when both hands reach for the soil, when both hearts bring water, when both souls choose to keep it alive.